All right, airworthiness requirements. Airworthiness is extremely important. We never want to fly a plane without the essential equipment working properly, just as I wouldn't want to go skydiving without a ripcord functioning. So there's different airworthiness requirements that would make an aircraft airworthy, and making sure that we're safe to fly is essential, and so that not only that we're being legal, but that we are staying safe. So we'll talk about what the airworthiness requirements are, how to determine if an aircraft is worthy of safe flight, and what must be met to ensure the aircraft is safe. A lot of things like documents need to be on board, certain inspections need to be done. Um, and if that's not done, then an aircraft is unairworthy. An unairworthy aircraft can still be flown, but it would need something called a special flight permit. So we're going to get into all that content, talking about airworthiness, talking about how to get that special flight permit, record keeping, preventative maintenance, and inoperative equipment. All right, so we'll start off with inoperative equipment. If I get to the aircraft and something is inoperative, um, we still need to determine if that aircraft is airworthy. So the equipment requirements are designed for safety. The following procedures are minimum requirements, and it's just to be legal to fly. So just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. Maybe I'm flying at night, and technically I don't need my standby attitude indicator to be legal. However, if I had any sort of, I'm in a G1000, so if I had any sort of AHARS failure and I lost my attitude indicator on my avionics and I have no backup and I'm at night, then that just adds to the level of risk associated with not having that backup in the first place. So if I'm not comfortable with it, don't fly. If I'm flying at night, I want my backup standby attitude indicator to be working. So set these personal minimums. So there's different ways to determine the airworthiness if we get to the aircraft before flight and we have inoperative equipment. The first is if we have a minimum equipment list, and the second is if we don't have a minimum equipment list. And this is the most common. Our aircraft we operate do not have a minimum equipment list. So, since we don't have a minimum equipment list, this is what we'll do. It's most widely used because it's simple and it's minimal paperwork. You have to go through a whole procedure of getting a minimum equipment list for your aircraft with, at the FSDO and get approval from the FAA. So we just don't use one. When inoperative equipment is found prior to flight, we decide whether to cancel the flight or continue by deferring to FAR 91213D. This is our this is the regulation for the steps we take for operating inoperative equipment without a minimum equipment list. So we'll get into that. We verify the equipment is not required by what's listed in 91213D, which is if it's required by day and night VFAR equipment, which is in 91205. We'll get into the acronyms of what all those equipment are. That's our 8 tomato flames, flaps, and grab card if we're flying instrument. Our kinds of equipment list. So this is going to be found in our POH, in our KOEL, or the kinds of equipment list, where it'll state whether that equipment is required or not. Then type certificate. Type certificate, when an aircraft is manufactured and before they start, doing the manufacture of making a bunch of planes, each of those planes within that specific model has to operate within a specific type certificate. Our comprehensive equipment list in our POH, I believe it's in section 6, is an indication as to what's required in the type certificate. We can also take a look at the type certificate online, and there's a future slide for that. And we're going to break this down even more, each of these 4 steps, so don't get too overwhelmed by what I'm saying right now. So again, day and night VFR required instruments, our kinds of equipment list, which is in our POH, type certificate, which we find online, but is also indicated by the comprehensive equipment list in our POH. So 2 different lists are within our POH, and an airworthiness directive. Remember, an airworthiness directive is basically like sort of like a recall for your car if there's an issue. An airworthiness directive gets basically it's additional maintenance that needs to be done on top of the normal maintenance that's required. So we're going to check if we need that as well. If it's not on any of these, if it's not required, then the equipment must be deactivated or removed and placarded as inoperative, and this is done by a mechanic. And yeah, right here, any maintenance must be accomplished by certified maintenance personnel. So we talked before about day and night VFR requirements in 91.205. Well, this is the required equipment for day, which is our A tomato flames. So we have our altimeter we need a tachometer for each engine, oil pressure gauge for each engine, manifold pressure gauge only if we have an altitude engine, which we do not have. We need an airspeed indicator, a temperature gauge only for liquid cooled engines, which we don't have, but we do have temperature gauges, but technically it's not required per 91.205. Oil temperature gauge for each air-cooled engine, so we definitely need this. We have an air-cooled engine. A fuel gauge for each tank. Flotation gear. So if I'm operating that aircraft for hire beyond gliding distance from shore, then you would need flotation gear. Landing gear position indicator. We have a fixed landing gear, so we don't need this. Anti-collision lights if our aircraft was certified after March 11th, 1996, which our aircraft certainly is. So we need anti-collision lights, or in the aircraft, these are our strobe lights. We need a magnetic compass or a magnetic direction indicator. So it doesn't have to be that compass that sits on top of the dashboard. This could be from our avionics, and that counts as the magnetic compass. Emergency locator transmitter, ELT. Basically, in the case of an accident, this has like a G meter on it that will automatically go off in the case that the aircraft crashes. That will immediately send a signal to emergency services. And the last is safety belts, shoulder harness. So this is our seat belts. This is our A Tomato Flames acronym. This is definitely going to be asked on stage checks, end of courses, check rides. Memorize A Tomato Flames. Memorize, tachometer for each engine, temperature gauge for each liquid-cooled engine, oil temperature gauge for each air-cooled engine, anti-collision lights certified after 1996, which our aircraft need. This is one of the most common check ride questions and one of the more notorious aviation acronyms. There's a million acronyms in aviation. A Tomato Flames is probably the most notorious one. So if we're flying at night, we need additional equipment. So this is our FLAPS acronym. So if I'm flying at night, I need everything within the day VFR required equipment. So I need A Tomato Flames plus FLAPS is our night VFR equipment, which is F for fuses. In our aircraft, we have circuit breakers. The difference between fuse and circuit breaker is a fuse, if an overvoltage situation is detected, it burns the fuse, disconnecting that circuit. A circuit breaker, on the other hand, it doesn't burn the circuit breaker and to disconnect it. The circuit breaker will pop if overvoltage situation is detected, and you can push it back in to reconnect that circuit. So that way, circuit breakers require less maintenance, because then if you blow a fuse, then that has to be replaced. A circuit breaker doesn't have to be replaced. Generally, if you're flying and a circuit breaker pops, you can push it in once, and if it stays, great. If it pops out again, don't touch it. Land as soon as possible. Anyway, that was a little side tangent just about the difference and kind of the operating practice with circuit breakers. So F fuses, or for us circuit breakers. L is landing light if it's for hire. So if we're flying with an instructor, they're flying for hire, we need our landing light. We also need our anti-collision lights. That's our strobe lights. We need our position lights, which is our nav lights. And then at the end of our flaps acronym is S for source of electricity for all equipment. So a source of electrical power. So that's our alternator. Our alternator provides that source of electrical power. And so if I had any of these things inoperative before flight, remember we go through 4 things if we find something's inoperative in our pre-flight. So I'll go through my day and night VFR required instruments, which is the 8 tomato flames and flaps, and say I get to my airplane and I realize my altimeter is not working. This altimeter is part of our day VFR requirements, meaning it's required for flight. That means the aircraft is not airworthy because that's not working, or for anything else on this list. Next is our kinds of equipment list. So chapter 2 of the POH is our KOEL. It lists the manufacturer required equipment based on flight type. So that'll let us know if that equipment is required. Let me look up like a 172 Sierra, just to pull up a KOEL. Okay, let's go to section 2. That's section 5. I went way too far. Section 2. Kinds of equipment list. Is it not in here? I'm gonna find it in section 2 here. Give me a second. It should be like big graphs. Maybe it's further towards the back. Further up. I just want to give you like a good visual of a kinds of equipment list so that you know what to look for. Okay, this is our comprehensive equipment list. I want to find my kinds of equipment list first. It's such a big document. Going up. Should be in section 2 here. Here, I'm gonna find it this way. So I'll use the POH from the ones at my school. So I can take 172. Here we go. So I should be able to find it in here. Here we go. Perfect. That was just because I pulled up a POH of some random Cessna 172 Sierra. But this is the one for our school. And here, our kinds of operating equipment list. So it'll tell me if I need this item with a 1, if I'm operating for the type of operation, VFR day, VFR night, IFR day, IFR night. So if I'm flying on a VFR day, and I notice that, my seatbelt's not working. Well, not only is our seatbelt required in 91205, our 8 tomato flames, remember that S was for seatbelt, it's also required here in our kinds of equipment list. So if I get out there and all of a sudden I see my beacon is inoperative, well, I'll look at my kinds of operation equipment list, and the 0 means it's not required. And looks like the strobe is required during the day. Nav light is not. Anyway, this is our kinds of operations equipment list, our KOEL. Next is our equipment list, usually found in the weight and balance data. specifies required equipment and equipment approved for the installation, approved for installation in the aircraft. So I can go back to my POH, and this was in section 6. So you can see on the bottom right, this would be section 7. So I need to go up a little bit. Here we go. Here's our comprehensive equipment list. So there's 2 different lists within our POH. If right next to the required item, it's an R, that means it's required. Anything else, it's not necessary. But for purposes of checking for required item, we're looking for an R. So if I look at, I don't know, something like fire protection, like my fire extinguisher, it's S. So it's not technically required to be within the aircraft. If I go for my lights, anti-collision lights are required. My beacon, it's not required. It's just standard equipment. Next is our type certification. So formal description of the airplane engine propeller, specifies the type of engine propeller, number of seats, etc. Gives the limitations and specifications that aircraft underwent for type certification. And basically our kinds of equipment list is an indication as to what's required in our type certificate based on its type certificate data sheet. Now we can also find our aircraft's type certificate data sheet if we go to the FAA's dynamic regulatory system, and I go down here to design and production approvals. I'll go to type certificate data sheet, and then I can put in my aircraft, like my 172 Sierra, which is what I fly, and then in this document it's got a ton of 172s, but I could find my model 172 Sierra, and then it gives us things like the engine we have to use, propeller limits, our weight, our CG range, maximum baggage, oil capacity. This is our type certificate data sheet. Found on the FAA and within the dynamic regulatory system, and then we find it through our aircraft. Next, we talk about ADs. So notifies pilots of an unsafe condition and requires action, like we talked about, being similar to a recall on a car. It's additional maintenance that needs to be done on our aircraft. There's 2 types of ADs. There is emergency ADs, requiring immediate action. So if there's an emergency AD for my aircraft, all 172s are grounded until this maintenance is done on that aircraft. So this is a big deal. And then there's a normal AD, or less urgent AD, which basically just has required compliance for either a specific time period, or sometimes there'll be an AD for maybe this fuel filter needs to be changed a little bit more often, so they make an AD. So every X number of hours this needs to be done, or X number of days this needs to be done, whatever is stated within the airworthiness directive. Airworthiness directives are mandatory maintenance that need to be done. Special airworthiness information bulletins, on the other hand, are not mandatory maintenance, but they're similar to an AD. So a lot of times it's additional maintenance that doesn't meet the requirements of airworthiness directive criteria. So these are put up by the manufacturer as to bring additional safety measures and additional maintenance that isn't required, but that conforms to safety. An AD is required, and it's produced by the FAA. So if we have something that's inoperative, so let's go through the process of something being inoperative. So let's say I get to my aircraft, I'm doing my pre-flight, I realize that my nav lights are inoperative. Well, is this equipment required by our kinds of equipment list? So I can go back to my 172, and I'll do the comprehensive equipment list while I'm here. So where I'm going to section 2, here's our kinds of equipment list, KOEL. Then the KOEL, remember our, did I say nav? We're doing nav lights. So I'll go to lights. Where's lighting? Where is it? Here we go. Aircraft position nav lights. 0, not required by the kinds of operation equipment list. Okay, let's go to the comprehensive equipment list in section 6. I'm in section 4. Here's section 5. Here we go. Comprehensive equipment list. So if there's an R next to what we're looking for, then that means it's required. Auto flight, communications, electrical power, equipment, fire, flight controls. We're looking for lights here. Lights, landing, anti-collision. Map light under control wheel. Flashing beacon, courtesy lights under wing, landing taxi light. It's not saying anything about our nav lights. Wonder if that would be under a different section. But it doesn't look like it. I'm going to just make sure I'm thorough here and look. So it wouldn't be under power plant, wouldn't be under windows, fuselage. Lights, looks like it's not in here. Landing, taxi, anti-collision, beacon. I want to make sure it's not anywhere else in here. Let's see if it's... Let me go back to the comprehensive equipment list. This is, I'm in section 7, I need to go up. Remember, the comprehensive equipment list is in section 6. Alright, looks like it doesn't say it in our comprehensive equipment list. So I'll go back here. Is it required by the aircraft, required by aircraft's type certificate? We didn't see it in the comprehensive equipment list. If I go back to the dynamic regulatory system, we've already looked up our 172 Sierra, and going through this, let's see, I need to go next. Here we go. This doesn't say anything about our lights that we have. No, anti-collision light system referred to, Alright. So, not required by the aircraft type certificate. If it's required by an airworthiness directive, we can also find airworthiness directives right here. So if I go to airworthiness directives, and again, I put in the model of my aircraft, I could find ADs. Our flight school tracks the airworthiness directives, so I can use the school system, look in there, make sure there's no airworthiness directive requirement for, again, my nav lights, which is what I'm using. And is the equipment required by FAR day-night equipment? So we'll go back to our 8 tomato flames and flaps. Let's just say I'm flying during the day, and I have anti-collision lights, yep, but there's no other equipment for requirement for lights here. So then it's not required by any of these. So what I need then to have happen is have maintenance deactivate placard, or deactivate or remove by the mechanic. Usually they just deactivate it, that way they don't have to redo a weight and balance. They placard it inoperative, and then I will determine as pilot in command whether the deactivated or removed equipment constitutes a hazard. No nav light, not going to constitute a hazard during the day. That's when you make that safe decision and that final authority. Because if you think whatever your inoperative equipment is won't allow you to remain safe, then you shouldn't fly, even if it's legal. So that was the entire process without a minimum equipment list. So let's talk about if we have a minimum equipment list. So this is kind of the commercial pilot knowledge that you'll get on the check ride. You're not going to get asked about this on a private pilot check ride. A minimum equipment list is basically a list that combines 91205, the KOEL, AD's type certificate into one document. Precise listing of the required equipment. It's common in the airlines. All the airliners have minimum equipment lists. We don't have them generally in general aviation, and it must be requested from the FAA. A minimum equipment list is also a aircraft serial number specific document. So it's specific for only one specific aircraft. So if I have a minimum equipment list and I find out equipment is inoperative, I refer to the MEL to determine what's required. If it's not deferrable, it must be repaired, and I'll just follow the instructions listed in the minimum equipment list. So sometimes it'll say, the pilots can do this sort of preventative maintenance procedure and still be good to fly. Another thing to note about the minimum equipment list is it doesn't have a list of all the things that need to be working to fly. It's a list of all the things that can basically be missing or broken and still fly, is what it is. And it has everything. Like, it'll include if there's a coffee pot that the flight attendants use to make coffee, if that's missing, can they still fly? So it's super comprehensive. Now let's get into required inspections, and this is our Aviate acronym. This is another notorious acronym in aviation. So first is our annual. So our aircraft need to go under an annual inspection every year, every 12 calendar months. Next is I'll talk a little bit more about the annual. The annual has to be done by an A&P mechanic that has their inspection authorization, or their IA. So basically mechanics, they become an A&P, they do additional work, and they can get their IA. We need an A&P mechanic with this additional IA to do our annual inspection. Not any A&P can do an annual, only one that has an IA. And our annual can be substituted for the required 100-hour inspection, which we'll get to in just a second. The V in our Aviate acronym is VOR. Must have been checked in the preceding 30 days. It's an IFR requirement, so not required for VFR flight. And this is a pilot-done inspection. So I've done a couple different VOR inspections before. And you just write it down in a little logbook. Make sure you do that every month, every 30 days. For instrument flight only. So flying visually, not required. 100-hour. Aircraft less than 12,500 pounds for us, which is what we are. Used for hire or flight instruction, needs a 100-hour inspection. Required, has to be done by an A&P mechanic. And you can exceed this by 100 hours, but no more than 10 hours, only to be used to be en route to the inspection location. So if my aircraft has, I get a 100-hour inspection done when the aircraft's at 100 hours total, like on its, its Hobbs time. And I need the next 100-hour inspection done at 200 hours. I can use the additional 10 hours to get that aircraft to the inspection location. So maybe I get that to the inspection location by the time it's at 205 hours. That next 100-hour won't be required at 305. It'll be required at the 100-hour interval. So I don't need that next 100 hours to be done at 300 hours. So that's how that works. And additionally, the 100-hour inspection and the annual are the exact same inspection. The only difference is the annual is done by an A&P mechanic with their inspection authorization, or an A&P mechanic with their IA. The 100-hour inspection can just be done by an A&P mechanic that doesn't have their IA. The A in our Aviate acronym, our second A, is for our altimeter pedostatic system. This is for IFR only, has to be done every 24 calendar months. Next is T for our transponder, must be tested and inspected every 24 calendar months. And our E is for our ELT, must be inspected every 12 calendar months. Now, one thing I want to throw on top of this, maybe the acronym should be A-Aviates, or A-Aviate, excuse me, and the additional A on top would be ADs, those airworthiness directives that need to be complied with. Additionally to our required inspections, we also have required documents that we need to keep on board the aircraft. And so again, both of these, this Aviate, this Aero, we talked about tomato flames, flaps, these are all acronyms that you have to have down by memory. We additionally need required documents to be on board the aircraft. The first is our airworthiness certificate, and it's valid as long as the aircraft stays airworthy. The airworthiness certificate also needs to be located within the cabin or cockpit entrance to be legible to passengers or crew. So that's why it's in that clear display right next to the pilot and commands, kind of like by their left knee. Next is our registration. Registration is now valid for 7 years, and it has to be carried in the aircraft at all times. So that's the federal registration. In my state, we also have a state registration that's valid for 1 year, and that also needs to be within the aircraft. The difference between the two is the registration. Say I get the registration in July 2020. I would need to get a new one in July 2027, right? It's due for, it's good for 7 years. The state registration for my state in Washington State is good from January 1st to December 31st. So you got to get a new one before the next year. And so it doesn't have that timeline like the registration. So if I just happen to get it in June, then it's good until June 7 years later. The state registration is good January 1st to December 31st, and then you got to get a new one. So that's the difference between the time limits between the two. Then we have our radio operator's license as our second R in the required documents, our AERO acronym, and this is only for flying international. And this is for not only the aircraft, but the pilot would have to have their pilot radio operator's license, which is easy to get. I think you just have to pay like $70 and you can just get it. Our O is our operating limitations. So that includes our POH that needs to be in the aircraft, our POH specific to the aircraft tail number that has the, specific to the aircraft tail number. What's also included within operating limitations is placards, things like our compass deviation card, our external data plate. Now, I know the external data plate isn't a document, but it is required. And also things like our avionics cockpit reference guide, things like that. Or, we need to have our emergency kit within the aircraft. So that all abides within operating limitations. But usually, if you just say POH, you'll be good to go on if you get asked about it on a check ride. And if they ask what else, then you can add the placards and like the cockpit reference guide, things like that. Then weight and balance specific to the aircraft tail number. This is the weight and balance that maintenance does to get the basic empty weight of that specific aircraft. So this weight and balance isn't the weight and balance we do before the flight to make sure that we're within our CG limits and our weight limits. This is the data that tells us what our basic empty weight is. Actually, kind of go back to airworthiness certificate. I said that the airworthiness certificate is valid as long as the aircraft is airworthy. But how do I know an aircraft is airworthy? The FAA definition for an airworthy plane is a plane is airworthy if it conforms to its original type design and is in condition for safe flight. So in plain English, we're airworthy, and this airworthiness certificate is valid as long as our documents are on board, our inspections are up to date, Our equipment is operational. We've gone through if there's inoperative equipment, what we do in the case of inoperative equipment. We don't have a minimum equipment list. Again, we go through our KOEL, comprehensive equipment list. Excuse me. 91205, that 8 tomato flames, flaps depending on the operation, and airworthiness directives. So if again, documents are on board, inspections are up to date, equipment is operational, and I conduct a thorough pre-flight, and that includes the pre-flight and the run-up, then our aircraft is airworthy. So airworthiness certificates, what we have in ours is a standard white airworthiness certificate for the normal category, which is where we fly within the vast majority of time. And it remains in effect as long as our aircraft stays airworthy like we were talking about. There's also special airworthiness. I'm not going to get into it. If our aircraft is not airworthy, we can still fly if we get what's called a special flight permit. Maybe an aircraft's not airworthy but is safe to fly. So maybe my annual inspection is passed. I should have gotten it, within 12 calendar months, but 14 months has passed, and now I can't fly the plane to get maintenance done. But the aircraft is still safe to fly. I can get a special flight permit and then fly to where that aircraft, those repairs can be made. It's also used for delivering, exporting aircraft, conducting customer demonstration flights. You can also get a special flight permit for an unairworthy aircraft if there's impending danger like a hurricane or anything like that. You can use a special flight permit for that. So how do we get a special flight permit? Well, you'll contact the local FSDO and you submit a statement describing the flight. You submit to obtain a special flight permit. If I was submitting and I got my flight permit, they want it to be on a clear visual VFR day, no passengers or non-essential crew. So a lot of times that's just single pilot, and you fly, straight to the where your destination is. Of course, safety permitting. If you need to make fuel stops, you'll put that within your submission, and that's allowed. But I can't take a buddy on a flight that has this special flight permit, because a special flight permit really is just a temporary airworthiness for a specific flight. And so they're clear about wanting it to be on a clear visual day, only essential crew on board, and you fly right there. So no detours, no sightseeing. All right, let's talk about some record keeping. 91.417 is the regulation for our record keeping. Required inspections in the aircraft are in the aircraft and engine logbook. So all of our, inspections are kept within the logbooks. Whenever you go on a check ride, you're going to present the maintenance logs to the examiner and to show them, yes, our aircraft is airworthy and we can fly. Records contain the following and must be retained and transferred with the aircraft if sold. So the total time in service, status of the parts, compliance with ADs, copied forms of major alterations, current inspection status of the airplane, all basically just standard maintenance information that is kept. A lot of it's, this is in charge of the maintenance personnel and the operator, but, we're going to be looking at these records, especially before stage checks, check rides, to make sure that these aircraft are safe to be flown. Removing, installing equipment not on the equipment list. So an aircraft maintenance technician must update the weight and balance for a new, for the new basic empty weight and center of gravity. And for major and minor repairs, if there's a major repair alteration, a Form 337 has to be completed by a certified repair station. And a minor repair, they just put an entry into the maintenance records. All right, preventative maintenance. This is maintenance that we as pilots can do on our aircraft. So anyone that's a holder of a pilot certificate can perform preventative maintenance. So at least a private pilot and a registered owner. Preventive maintenance is simple or minor preservation operations, replacement of small standard parts not involving complex assembly. So if we go to 43 Appendix A C30, it gives us a list of what preventive maintenance actions we have. So this bold method article lists it out. Things like removing landing gear tires, servicing wheel bearings, struts, changing your oil, replacing seat belts, replenishing hydraulic fluid, replacing and servicing batteries. You can do any of those things within that list. And if you do, then you have to make a record of it. So you put the description, completion date, signature, your type of certificate, certificate number, and your type of certificate into the maintenance records. For FAR 4313 states that the quality of work and parts need to be basically to a certain standard, and return to service. At least a private pilot may approve that aircraft to be returned to service. So that could be you if you're a private pilot, you own your own airplane, you do some preventive maintenance, you make the maintenance logs, and you can return to service. So we talked about when we run into inoperative equipment before flight. What if we run into inoperative equipment in flight? We have some sort of electrical failure, and we have, maybe I have an oil pressure gauge that goes bad. So this is where maintenance deferrals discussed here are not used for in-flight. We're gonna do POH procedures and make smart aeronautical decision making. If I have a oil pressure that goes down, I might expect my engine to fail soon, if it didn't already after seeing that indication. But you never know. You could have something like a faulty sensor. But either way, I want to treat it like an engine failure, land as soon as possible. So until that engine quits, I'm going to be heading for an airport, and then also on my way be scouting for any field that I need to potentially land it if my engine fails. Combined with risk assessment and mitigation techniques to assist in decision making. So we'll just do our emergency procedures for whatever inoperative equipment takes precedent. So that's all that's required for the ACS required info. We'll go to some just additional info that's also required for the airworthiness. Maybe one other thing I wanted to touch on was there's an exception for ELTs. If I go to 91-207, so for ELTs, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself here because it might be in this presentation as well. But on top of the ELT inspection every 12 calendar months, every time the transmitter has been used for more than 1 cumulative hour, or when half of the useful life has expired, you need to either recharge the batteries or have the batteries replaced. Awesome. And then this one, the ELT also doesn't need to be within the aircraft if it's been within 90 days of it being removed, and you're just engaging in training operations being conducted within a 50 nautical mile radius from the airport. So this is just a strange caveat where you could operate an aircraft without an ELT, despite it being on our 91205 8 Tomato Flames acronym. But we can see 91207 F3 here. Aircraft section doesn't apply to aircraft while engaged in training operations conducted entirely within a 50 nautical mile radius from the airport. So an aircraft for any period as well where it's been temporarily removed, you can't operate that aircraft after 90 days. So if that ELT gets removed, I can only operate that for 90 days with the removed ELT. Anyway, just another another unique caveat there. Kind of a gotcha question on a check ride. So we'll talk about some additional things like FAR 91.3 states that the pilot in command is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of the airplane. So I'm making the decisions to fly the airplane and make the decisions, especially if I'm in flight and there's an emergency, whatever. I'm the pilot in command, and I'm going to make sure that aircraft is airworthy before I fly, which is why I need to know what makes an aircraft airworthy, how to knowing what these inspections are, knowing what documents are required, knowing what to do with equipment that's inoperative and what steps I need to go through. 91.7, no person may operate a civil aircraft unless it is in an airworthy condition. You know what means an aircraft is airworthy? Again, documents are on board. The inspections are complied with. The equipment is operational. We've conducted a safe pre-flight and run-up. Now our aircraft is airworthy. So it's our responsibility to determine the aircraft is safe for flight, and we'll discontinue the flight if the aircraft is unairworthy. So, even one time I've been out to the plane, I did the pre-flight, all the maintenance was done, I checked the documents, looked good, the equipment was working, I did my pre-flight, then we get to the run-up, and all of a sudden we failed the run-up check, and so then you make the determination that the aircraft is not safe for flight, taxi right back to the ramp. FAR 91.9, for aircraft in which a flight manual is required, it must be on board. So in our AERO acronym for the documents required to be on board, our operating limitations is one of them, meaning we need to have our POH, or same thing, flight manual, POH, same. Some aircraft don't need to have a flight manual or AFM if the plane was registered after or before 1979. 91.2.3, no person may operate an aircraft unless it has the following: airworthiness and registration. We talked about that. This is in our AERO acronym. Airworthiness must be displayed in the cabin cockpit entrance. So we have our airworthiness in that clear coat on the pilot side. We also need to comply with 91.205, bare minimum instruments and equipment. That's our 8 tomato flames and flaps. For instrument, it's our grab card acronym on top of 8 tomato flames. Again, if we have inoperative equipment without a minimum equipment list, then we have to go through our flow of figuring out if that aircraft is airworthy. So we're going to see if it's required by a type certificate data sheet, or if our aircraft has it, a supplemental type certificate. So a supplemental type certificate is just additional data added onto the type certificate data sheet. And we'll check our KOEL, that comprehensive equipment list, and we'll check if it's required by 91.205, 91.207, that 8 tomato flames. And then if it's required by an AD. If it's required by any of these, then the plane's not airworthy. If it's not, the equipment must be removed, deactivated. And if no still, then you make the decision as to whether the aircraft is safe to fly. If that inoperative equipment, after being deactivated, placarded, inoperative, if that still poses a threat to flight, then you can still, as PIC, make the decision not to fly, even though it might be legal, it might not be safe. Maintenance. Maintenance is the responsibility of the operator and the owner of the aircraft. The regulation for the annual and the 100 hour is listed in 91.407. 91.411 is the reg for our static pressure and altimeter test for IFR. 91.413 is the reg for our transponder. Kind of nearing the end here. I talked about it. I did get a little bit ahead of myself. So 91.207 is for our ELT inspection every 12 calendar months. If the transmitter has been used for more than one cumulative hour, or 50% of its useful life has expired, the battery must be replaced or recharged. And that's about it for inoperative equipment. So What's important about the inoperative equipment is knowing, being able to explain, if you're asked, how do you know if an aircraft is airworthy, knowing the required documents, knowing the required inspections. Remember, our documents is our AERO acronym, the required inspections, our Aviate acronym there. Getting a special flight permit, how to get that, preventative maintenance, being able to list at least a few items within that preventative maintenance. Remember those in 43.3 Appendix A, C. Our VFR day instruments, so our atomidal flames and flaps, and flying with inoperative equipment. So making sure it's not required by a type certificate data sheet. Our KOEL, our comprehensive equipment list. 91205, the atomidal flames, or an airworthiness directive. If no, deactivated, placarded, inoperative, then PIC determines whether that inoperative equipment constitutes a hazard. Really, that's really the gist of it. Thanks for watching.